Hi all, welcome back to Make More Bonsai, John here. In this little video I hope to share with you my own personal homegrown process that allows us to get from this to this in a relatively timely manner. Well, timely for a bonsai anyway. I'm going to try to discuss and help define some of the key actions one can take to start a successful bonsai production pipeline that you can adapt to your own bonsai journey or whatever your goals may be. For this video, let's turn our focus to Japanese black pine. They are a super popular species for bonsai, and they respond really well to bonsai training, which all in all improves the odds for success as a bonsai. Choose trees that are showing signs of good health. This is really important. If they are weak or haven't really started to grow aggressively, any styling attempt may not work out well. We should always work with strong starter material. What's really great about the black pine seedlings is you can pretty much perform this kind of wiring at any time. Fall and winter is really best, but they do just as well if you do this work in spring or summer. Let's start making some funky trunks with some pine. For this one, let's work towards a Mame size tree. When designing at such a small scale, the width of the trunk will intentionally be kept small and proportional to the height. The bends of the trunk will also need to be in proportion in order to convey the image or illusion of a large tree captured in this miniature state. At this scale, the design for the tree will need to be visually appealing within a very small amount of space. The eye of the observer will travel only a few inches to take in the overall impact of the design. For this to be effective, the curves and direction changes will need to be closer together. They also should change direction over a smaller distance, all in service to the information the design delivers in proportion with the height. This may take more than one wiring session. The first session will establish some shape and movement, but the limits of how far one can bend the trunk before it breaks may be reached. A second or third session may be needed after the tree has assumed the shape from the previous wiring. So let's proceed with the awareness that in a few months or even a year, the shape may be further modified. First, we're going to insert the aluminum wire deep into the pot to firmly anchor it. We want that wire to not move around in the pot. We don't want to disturb the roots. Next, wrap the wire around the trunk while firmly holding the bottom in place. This coil will be about 45 to 50 degrees and placed evenly, touching the trunk, meaning there shouldn't be a gap between the trunk and the wire. Next, move your hand to firmly hold the wire and again wrap that wire at the 45 to 50 degree angle consistent with the previous coil. Continue until you reach the top of the seedling. Be careful not to wire down any needles, either move them out of the way or pluck them to make room for the coil. I'm able to get about 5 clean coils around this small trunk. To begin bending, my goal is to get a height-reducing bend in the lowest part of the trunk. Using the outside of the first coil as the placement of my first curvy bend, putting pressure on the wire that is against the outside of that curve, I'm bending the trunk all the way down. This is easy since the pine seedling is young and very flexible. Next, in the direction of the wire coil, I'm twisting the trunk about 20 to 30 degrees. This small twist accomplishes two things. A, I'm able to get a little more room to bend since the energy created from the bend is spread over more area in the trunk. And two, over time, as bark forms, it will follow the grain and direction, making the lower trunk more interesting as the bark will also be turning in the direction, adding dimension to the bark of the tree. The next bend is in the opposite direction, bringing the tree back around and down, adding that gesture that returns the tree back onto itself. A final bend brings the top down, raising a branch up to the top. A few final adjustments and the first wiring is finished. The height has been drastically reduced and 4 initial bends have been placed into the trunk. This tree will now overwinter with the wire on. Next year, we will review the trunk, and if the wire is cutting into the trunk, it'll be removed and rewired in the same direction as the original wire. Let's do another one, but maybe a little smaller. Same application of wire, but this time we're only able to get 3 coils because the tree is so small. A few small gestural bends, and this tree is also finished. It has 3 starter bends in it, and next year it'll also be rewired and new bends will take place to add more dimension to the trunk's curves. Let's take a few to talk about what's happening to the tree after all this work is done. When you perform a bend, you're injuring the cellular tissue in that section you're bending. The outside of the bend stretches the tissue and the inside compresses the tissue. This triggers the tree to send resources to those areas to repair and rebuild. If we take a look at the inner workings of the branch or trunk, we can better understand what's happening. There are 3 layers surrounding the core wood of the tree throughout. The inside layer is called xylem, which brings water and resources up through the tree. The outside layer is called phloem. Phloem transports nutrients created through photosynthesis by the foliage down through the tree. Between them is a layer called cambium. This is the layer of cells that creates all the things a tree needs, such as leaf buds, roots, and new cells that contribute to the creation of fresh xylem and phloem. The cambium cell divides, leaving behind fresh xylem and pushing out fresh phloem. This thickens the tree as it grows. When an area is damaged, like from all the stuff we've been doing in this video, the cambium divides more aggressively to repair the area and get it functioning like it used to. This action creates more xylem, cambium, and phloem in that area, fattening and stiffening it to repair the damage. Over time, the damage is completely healed and the excess of cells created contribute to the area retaining the shape as it was manipulated into during the bend. Now that we've been reminded that these are living things that have all kinds of internal doodads that perform tasks to keep this tree alive, it's time to get back to exploiting this knowledge and manipulate these trees to our heart's content. One thing I do recommend is to draw inspiration from existing bonsai. Just like this channel's second call to action states, study the work of masters. Remember, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, or I think it was Picasso who said, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal." Develop the muscle memory aspect of creativity and practice using real-world examples. It's better to start with something that inspired you. For this example, this tree has some really expressive direction changes that are worth exploring. When drawing from this kind of inspiration, try to capture what gestures you really appreciate, but be aware of the tree you're working on and its limitations. You may need to halt bending when the tree reaches its level of tolerance. You can resume studying the decisions made by the creator of the tree you're imitating a little later, when it's time for a second wiring. Or take it new places. Speaking of a second wiring, here's a tree that was wired in spring, about 5 months earlier. Let's proceed with this tree's second wiring. We can see that the wire is cutting into the trunk a bit. This is a good sign that the tree has assumed the shape created in the previous wiring. After unwiring the tree, we can see if there are places that maybe can use some refinement. Start by carefully unwiring the tree. Be sure to look out for any new buds you may want to preserve. When reapplying the wire, be sure to wire in the same direction as the previous wire, but not in the same grooves that were created when the old wire cut into the trunk. This will eventually become an interesting texture as the tree matures and grows bark. Be careful not to wire down any needles. Take your time and clean any needles that may get compressed under the wire. Once fully wired, look for opportunities to enhance the previous bends, maybe adding a small indent to an existing curve. A gentle twist of about 30 degrees will also engage new dimensions to the bark texture as it matures. Bend it a bit forward, then reduce the height with a sharper return, again using the pre-made curves from the previous wiring. And remember to have fun doing this. Bonsai is supposed to be fun. I'm really glad I wired these 5 months ago. This allowed the second wiring of this tree to occur within the same year. Now is a good time to talk about choices. Do we keep a tree in a very small pot, which will limit its access to air and water to the capacity of what that small pot can provide, which will essentially slow its growth down due to those limits, which is perfectly fine, or do we want the tree to develop at a somewhat faster rate with a bit more growth that will lead to faster trunk development? We can offer this tree a larger pool of resources by transplanting it into a slightly larger pot. This process of stepping up in pot size, in this example, we'd be taking it out of a 4-inch pot it currently resides in and placing it into a slightly larger 5 or 6-inch pot. Pines do get their energy from their roots, so offering the tree more room to expand the root system will sort of be like pressing the gas pedal when driving on a side street onto an expressway. Since we're doing this procedure in fall, the roots are already doing lots of work gathering and storing as much energy as possible to store over winter for next spring's growth push, so they will definitely appreciate the extra real estate to expand into. I like to use a soil mix that includes roughly 50% akadama for its porous structure, mixed with inexpensive potting soil and perlite or pumice. This stage of the bonsai production pipeline leads toward more growth and more resources. A richer soil will deliver plenty of resources for the tree to devour and grow and fatten. Once the tree has reached its desired width, that's when we begin to change the growing medium to a larger proportion of akadama to encourage a finer root system that will help reduce the internodes and needle length. We should see some really expansive growth when next spring arrives. Here's a pine that was stepped up last year after wiring and allowed to grow out all spring and summer. That new growth has extended 8 to 10 inches. As a result, the initial curves that were wired into the trunk have firmed up and are beginning to show some expansion in width. Now's a good time to rewire and spread some of those branches out to allow more light to feed future growth, and begin to form an updated trunk extension as well as placing potential branches, or at least a sacrifice branch that will be removed later after it's fed the trunk below it. All to add value to the work that was performed the previous year. All of these trees are frankly very small. What if we wanted to make some larger bonsai of the 2-hand or 1 or more man size, for variety? The process at this seedling stage is pretty much the same, but there are some things to consider when designing for a larger scale tree. For Mame trees, we're concerned with keeping curves and direction changes aligned to a very small proportion. If it were to grow much larger, many of these tiny bends would all but disappear over time when the trunk's overall width kind of consumes it. What do I mean by this? As the tree grows, the trunk and branches get wider and wider around the center as more and more layers of cambium, xylem, and phloem push outward every year. Over time, a space that exists when a trunk is thinner will get smaller and smaller as the overall width of the trunk expands. When growing larger sized trees with wider and taller trunks, the changes in direction of the overall gestures can be spaced further apart. So if you're considering growing a larger scale bonsai, it's worth considering keeping the bends and curves wider at this initial wiring stage, with the expectation of adding gesture to the tree as it matures over time. In this first wiring session, we're only going to set up the lower trunk. Since this seedling is really flexible, it's a great opportunity to take control and create an expressive base that departs from the surface roots. Creating a unique gesture that adds immediate character to this section of a tree is easy at this stage. It becomes more and more difficult the older the bonsai stock is. Once that's set, encourage it to grow and extend. Those extensions can later be wired out to develop a full trunk line over the following year or two. After this tree has had that second wiring to further define the main trunk line, the upcoming few years will be spent encouraging growth to fatten the trunk to support the design, and encouraging a few sacrifice branches to extend way out from the design to keep the gas pedal pressed from the demand of the extended vascular activity needed to support growth. Once the main structure of the trunk and the future branches are established, our strategy now shifts to taking steps to thicken and add character to these essential design elements. For that, let's talk about that gas pedal, but this time we'll add some high-octane fuel for acceleration to the mix. What has brought that boost of resources so far has been placing the tree into a slightly larger pot. The reasoning behind it is to increase the resources available for the tree to consume to grow more vigorously. For this larger scale bonsai, this tree needs to have access to the most resource-rich environment possible to experience maximum development over the shortest period of time possible. That requires us to expose the tree to direct contact with the ground by planting it in the ground. In early spring, remove the tree from its pot and trim off the taproot. Spread the roots evenly around a board or flat tile under the base of the trunk. This barrier under the tree will help guide the roots outward and prevent a deep taproot from growing directly under the trunk, and encourage a wide base of the trunk with attractive and level surface roots to develop, which look great when finally planted into a bonsai container. Over the next 5 years, yes, I said 5 years, encourage a long sacrifice trunk to extend upwards, keeping the lower part of the trunk clear to allow light to reach the bonsai portion you're developing below. That lower part can be pruned and decandled every year to encourage inner buds and short branches. Meanwhile, the sacrifice branches can remain long and strong to create a lot of vascular movement that will thicken the trunk below. Here are a few examples of pines currently developing directly in the ground. This one has been in the ground for a year. The trunk is already thickening at 4 times the rate it would if it were grown in a pot. These two have been in the ground for about 4 years. You can see how much they've expanded and how well the bark is developing. These branches on the lower bonsai part have been pruned and decandled every year to create a dense network of branches to choose from when it's finally ready to be trained as a bonsai. That sacrifice trunk on each of them is about 5 feet high and doing a lot of the work adding vascular activity and expanding the trunks. These trees will continue to develop in the background, barely needing any attention, but in time, they'll become the next project when they're ready. Let's talk a little bit about why. Why do this at all? Wherever you are in your bonsai journey or practice, there's always something more to learn. There's always a new source of inspiration or technique to pick up along the way. While you're out there accumulating those new experiences, These starter bonsai will time travel with you, benefiting from the progression of your bonsai practice as they grow. When the time comes and you are both ready to take that next step, you will have captured your progression in bonsai as it once was to as it is now, which is kind of how the journey of growing bonsai is. Long stretches of growth and change, followed by a capturing of a moment that reaches the peak of expression, then back to more growth and change. And to kind of step away from all this poetic waxation, these methods were practiced when I was working in a bonsai nursery like a gazillion years ago at a much larger scale. Adapting these methods by scaling it down from acres of little trees everywhere to a more realistic backyard pastime setting that can easily fit into your lifestyle, and by having a focused plan that takes direct aim at your goal, whether it's a diminutive Mame-sized tree no bigger than your hand to something with a bit more heft, one can have a satisfying experience of success as mere mortal civilians. You'll be accumulating quite the collection of bonsai material that meets your personal standards in no time, ready for you when inspiration strikes, or to share with friends or clubs, or whatever feeds your soul. We've covered a lot of ground, so to speak, with this video. I hope this will trigger some inspiration for you to consider starting your own bonsai production pipeline, one that fits your space and your path in your bonsai journey. Bonsai is, above all else, supposed to be fun. If any of these techniques lead to successful achievements as you pursue your bonsai dream, then the time spent with this video was worth it. Thanks for watching. I hope you gained some helpful insights from this little video. Maybe like and subscribe and leave a comment below, and possibly check out the book or the t-shirt and hat links in the Show More section below. Your participation and support really helps energize this little production and helps me dream up new stuff to show you, because bonsai stuff is kinda cool, and so are you for helping support this channel.